So, hello everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to open this really exciting meeting. And it really is an honour to be asked to do this, and I'm really interested and excited about what we might discuss today. So my title is Socially Responsible Research in Cognitive Systems. No-win or win-win. I was going to put socially robust, but then I wasn't sure if anybody would know what socially robust means. Hands up if you understand the term socially robust. Okay, maybe 3 people. So that's good I didn't use it. Socially robust is a term that the European Commission uses when it talks about good science. And so I think it's a term we need to come to terms with. You can roughly translate it as socially responsible, but I'll explain what socially robust is as we get through. Now, the theme of my talk is really to discuss the change in the way that the European Commission particularly, but I think European governments generally, think about science and the impact that that has on the way we do science, and importantly, of course, on what science gets supported and funded. And I've been involved in several meetings like this, and I know that a lot of the time the people that do science and that build cognitive systems get frustrated that there looks to be another layer of bureaucracy and assessment that's going to be introduced to the research that we do, that we need to have these ethical assessments to decide whether our projects are valid and appropriate. So the question is it a no-win situation for research? Is it just another layer of unnecessary work that we have to do? Or could it be a win-win situation whereby these ethical hurdles, if that's what they are, could in some way help us do better research? And I think it's an open question, and I want to give you some ideas on it, but I think we should debate it in the next 2 days. So why am I here? So Vincent said I'm a professor of neuroscience. I'm actually a professor of cognitive neuroscience. I'm in the Department of Psychology, and when I got my chair, they asked, well, what do you want your title to be? And they said, do you want to be Professor of Psychology? And I said, well, I don't really do psychology. I do robotics and connectionism and behavioral neuroscience. So what do you call that? And eventually I came up with cognitive neuroscience, which is mostly about brain imaging, which I don't do, but in a way it's an umbrella term that kind of fits. So what I do is psychology, AI, robotics. I do a lot of computational neuroscience, and I investigate robots controlled by computational neuroscience models, biomimetic robotics. And that's my research background that I've been doing really since 1989 when I started my PhD. Though going back before that, I did my degree in psychology, I did courses in computer science, I did courses in philosophy. So I regarded myself, and still regard myself, as a cognitive scientist, although that term is perhaps being used less and less these days. So I've, in the last 15 years, participated in numerous European projects in the cognitive systems and robotics areas. And in 2011, I was the leader of the Society Working Group for a flagship pilot for the robot companions for citizens. And I think I was asked to do that because I was in a psychology department, and psychologists should know about society. And I was honored to be asked, so I said I'd do it. And part of leading that group, and it was a working group which met 3 or 4 times over the course of a year and produced a report, or several reports. Out of doing that, I learned a lot about societal and ethical issues in our field of research. And what I want to do is share with you some of the things that I learned then. Also in 2011, we started the Sheffield Centre for Robotics. And being at the head of that centre has involved me with lots of outreach and talking to journalists and so on. And so I know the kinds of questions that certainly journalists are interested in, and I think that the general public are interested in. So the robot companions, unfortunately, wasn't funded. We came 3rd out of 6, which is an honourable way of losing, I guess. And we produced this report on ethical and social issues, which you can access at that tiny URL. And that includes some of the things that I'm going to say today in this talk. So we're going to talk a lot at this meeting about what's on the horizon for society and for humanity in terms of cognitive systems research. And there is a lot, and it's very exciting, and some people would say it's quite scary too. I'm not going to talk about these areas in this talk except for one. I'm going to talk about robots in personal care. But people are aware that increasingly we are building autonomous systems, and we're putting them in charge of critical infrastructure like power stations. And those autonomous systems are processing more and more information, making more and more decisions by themselves. And there's the potential even, and some people are trying to do this, to make them aware of themselves in the sense of aware of their own actions and reasoning about their own future. We have driverless vehicles which are not on our streets mainly for legal reasons rather than technological reasons, but they will be there. We have robots performing surgery. Right now it's teleoperation, but in the future it could easily be autonomous robots that are performing our operation. And we could potentially have robots in personal care. Right now we have sort of Skype on a stick that wanders around and you can talk to it, but in a few years' time we may have more autonomous robots that can do tasks of personal care like cleaning, dressing, even being your robot friend. We have potential for cognitive enhancements. Already we have mobile technology that makes us more connected, but cognitive enhancement could give us better memory. It could give us better ways of thinking. And we have the option to embed that technology in our own bodies. We can have brain-machine interfaces. We can have smart prostheses of various kinds. And perhaps we can look forward to a more biohybrid future where human beings augment themselves with pieces of technology, some of which may be implanted for life. So all of these things suggest a radically different future to today's present, and they remind us why it's important that cognitive systems research considers the long-term future and not just the things we want to do tomorrow, because the work that we're doing does have these potentially incredible long-term impacts which will change the way the world is. So my talk will have three parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about what I'm calling the evolving ethical landscape of European science. And really, I'm going to tell you about what the European Commission has been thinking about science. And it's things that I learned as part of the Robot Companions for Citizens Working Group about European thinking on science. It's not something that I myself endorse, but it's what is coming out of their documents. And I'm going to show you quite a lot of their documents and the things that they have been thinking and are saying about ethics in science. Then I'm going to quickly summarize the conclusion we reached in the Robot Companions for Citizens pilot about how we can apply ethics in robot companions, but I think it's more general in cognitive systems research. And then finally, I'm going to talk about an example closer to my own area of how we can apply ethics in the domain of robots in care, and how we as researchers should respond to the ethical questions around the use of controversial use of our technology, such as the use of robots in care. So, the European view of science. Well, I want to first start of all with this document from a very recent one from the Technologies Advisory Group, ISTAG. And it's good news for cognitive systems research. They say that ICT is the key innovation enabler, and that Europe must continue to focus on ICT as a key technology area. And of course, cognitive systems as one of the more blue sky aspects of ICT is a central part of that. But they also say, and this is in response to some of the thinking and decision making which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, that policy needs to include new non-traditional stakeholders who become increasingly important to articulate both technological opportunities and social concerns. Part of the reason for this meeting, I think. And it becomes more crucial, the collective interest in technology development and its usage becomes more crucial. Political and ethical research gains importance for ICT research. So ISTAG is one of the groups informing Horizon 2020. This is part of the agenda for the future of European research. So when we think about ethics in science, I want to contrast two views. One I'm calling a traditional view. There may be nobody here that espouses it, but certainly you can find people that will support this position. And that is that science, if it is performed well, is intrinsically neutral. What we're doing is looking at the world, observing it, and trying to explain it. And it's good, because the more we understand about nature and about the world around us, the better that is, and the more we can do to improve our lot. And that is a traditional view of science, which some people here might want to defend. In traditional science, ethics is about compliance with certain codes and regulations. So, for instance, codes about how we conduct science, how we use our data, when we publish, that we are fair in the way we describe our data and complete, that we treat our colleagues well, all these other things, that we don't do research which harms others. And occasionally expert advice. If you have an issue about your research, maybe you go and ask an expert, is it ethical to do this? And they might advise you of the regulations, or they might plough through some Home Office handbook and say, yes, it's okay to do this particular experiment, but not that one. If there are undesirable impacts of science, then we tend to leave it to the people that are applying the science to address those. So we assume that we do the science, we discover interesting things. People do technology transfer, they take it out into the world, they build stuff based on the science. Some of those things may have unexpected negative impacts, and then we expect that there will be corrections made for those impacts. But that problem of correcting for the bad things that might come out of science isn't our problem, it's somebody else's problem. So you may endorse this, you may not, but I think it describes a lot of the approach to science that I think people in the universities have had in the past. A more contemporary view of ethics in science, and I'm going to explain where it comes from in the next few minutes, is that it's not isolated from society and from politics. That science is a social endeavour, it's something that we do as part of society, not separate from society. And that ethical science requires not that we don't think about the consequences of how science is used, but we do think about it, that we think about it early, and we try and characterize the risks that could arise from our science at every stage. And that doing that involves the need for public dialogue. It's more than just about talking to potential end users. It's about talking throughout society to different stakeholder groups and seeing what they think of the science that we're doing. This is moving towards socially robust science, as the European Union defines it. Integrating ethics into science requires that we listen to the critical, skeptical, and even dissenting voices and see what they think, and that it can impact on our science. It can certainly impact on our science funding. What's behind this changing view of ethics in science? Well, there has been a very important shift in the way people think of science as an activity. And this shift has come about through work, and I guess in the area of science and technology studies, where people have looked at science as it is practiced to try and understand what it is that scientists do and how it should be governed. And we can contrast, and this is work led by Helga Nowotny, and this book, The New Production of Knowledge, describes this distinction that they made between mode 1 science, science as discovery, if you like, traditional science, or science as it once used to be. And according to this, science is a separate enterprise that pursues its own ends, which is discovery. And it does so through universities, through independent researchers, asking questions, doing experiments, finding things out about the world. And in mode 1, there are fairly clear disciplinary boundaries. So people know who's doing what. Physicists understand other physicists, but respect that they don't understand other chemists. There's a clear path to assessing what's good science and what is not. And scientists and the host institutions operate autonomously. They're left alone by government. scientists are left alone by university managers. That would be nice. And they just get on and they do interesting and enjoyable science. But mode 2 is science as it is now, or at least science as it's seen by some people in science and technology studies and by the European Commission. Science is seen as a kind of knowledge production. I think partly this is because the European Commission and the European Union has made science into a form of knowledge production. It's taken mode 1 and it's altered it. Not just the European Commission, but funding agencies and governments generally have altered how we do science. Perhaps we are complicit in this as well as scientists. But science has become a more socially distributed enterprise pursued by different groups with diverse motivations, so that can include commercial interests. So nowadays, if you're involved in a European project, you quite likely have an industrial partner, and they have an interest in the science that you're doing and what it might mean and what its significance might be. But outside industrial partners, there are many other groups who also have an interest in science. There are think tanks, there are various activist groups, all of them contributing, all of them thinking that they have an important voice that should be heard by science policymakers. So scientists, academic scientists, are no longer the sole voice talking about science. Many other people have a view and opinion on science. Science has become more application-oriented because increasingly we are asked to think about how the science is going to be used, and before we do the science we're asked to think, well, what use is this going to be? What new products are going to come out of it? What new answers are we going to have that are going to improve human life? And maybe that's fair enough, but it means that the science that we do is no longer neutral in the sense of being unmotivated. We now have goals which are not just to understand. And science has become transdisciplinary. So nowadays we do large collaborative projects in which people from many different disciplines come together for a period of a few years. They do some interesting work, then they disband and they form into other transdisciplinary relationships. So the boundaries between the disciplines have become weaker and perhaps dissolved, and maybe this is also a good thing. Scientists are also subject to many accountabilities. No longer is it just a case of getting peer-reviewed and published in good journals. There are many other things that we have to do as scientists in order to keep our jobs. If you don't necessarily agree with that mode 1, mode 2 contrast, then perhaps you'll recognize these trends, which I think are indicative of what Nowotny and her colleagues are calling mode 2, that research priorities are increasingly steered at the international, national and institutional level. So the European Union decides what the research priorities are. The government in the UK decides what the research priorities are. Fortunately for me, they decided recently that robotics was a research priority. But that's good news for me, bad news for somebody in another field. Institutionally, we follow the government, but we also may think that our institutions have certain strengths and that we want to be great at cognitive systems, and we don't mind so much about chemistry. So research priorities are steered. As individual scientists, this affects us directly. There is an increasing link between science and innovation. So no longer do we just do science to understand the world. We do science in order to innovate, in order to invent new products. And that leads to what might be called the commercialization of research and knowledge becoming a product, and increased emphasis on intellectual property, which leads to universities having new departments that are interested in talking to you about your research and whether it should be patented before you publish it. And this, I think, was happening maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it's happening more and more to us now. And scientists have become more accountable. It's not just about getting your good papers. It's about getting your grants, getting your grant income. It's about getting your ref submission of 4 good papers in the right time frame, in the right kinds of journals. It's about becoming accountable to lots of different people for different reasons. So science as an activity has changed. As a result of all this, it's argued that science is no longer neutral. And this is, again, a quote from Nowotny and her colleagues. Science, the single epistemological ideal of a neutral view from nowhere, which is objective science, as we'd like to think of it, has been replaced by multiple views, with each view situated somewhere. So everybody is thought to have an angle, and nobody is considered to be neutral in the traditional sense. So, and this obviously then impacts on how we judge science, because we start to judge people in terms of where we think they're coming from. So while scientific excellence remains an indispensable criteria, there are obviously additional criteria, economic, political, social, or cultural, that we use to judge whether somebody is doing good or useful science. Now, I wouldn't be telling you all this if it was just some people in science and technology studies writing about science, thinking about science, and coming up with their own theories. This is, as many of you may know, the president of the European Research Council who is espousing these views, Helga Nowotny. So when she says these things, we know that they've been influential in European policy making. And this is another quote: "A 21st century view of science must not only embrace the wider societal context, but be prepared for the context to begin to talk back. Reliable knowledge will no longer suffice, at least in those cases where the consensuality reached within the scientific community will fail to impress those outside. It's not enough to convince your fellow scientists about your view of nature. You have to impress the public now too. In a 21st century view of science, more will be demanded from science, a decisive shift towards a more extended notion of scientific knowledge, namely a shift towards socially robust or context-sensitive knowledge." So there's that expression, socially robust. Socially robust means not that your ideas, your science gets accepted by your community, but your ideas, your science gets accepted by the public at large and gets valued by the public at large. So are the public really worried about what we're doing as scientists? Do we need to stress about this? Well, I think in our field it's clear there is some concern, but it's not clear that the concern has reached a critical point. This is another, I think, important report from the Expert Group on Science and Governments for the Science, Economy and Society Directorate, another EU report. And it talks about public unease with science, which they recognise exists. The public is thought to fear science because scientific innovations entail risk, which I think is fair enough. The widespread sense of unease, sometimes expressed as mistrust or alienation from science, must be seen in a broader perspective. And the positive news is that they conclude there is no general indiscriminate public disaffection with or fear of science. Instead, there is selected disaffection in particular fields of science amidst wider areas of acceptance and even enthusiasm. So if we can keep the public on side, then they're enthusiastic about our research. And I think that's true of our research in particular, that there are many enthusiasts out there that want us to do this research, that are very interested in the results. But there's areas of research which have got into trouble by failing to keep the public on board. And the obvious example is genetic modification of food. And if we look out there, it's very difficult to buy genetically modified food in British supermarkets. It's a different story for in the US, which I don't think it's labelled, but here it'll be labelled on the can as GM modified, and many shops won't sell it. And the reason is that there was a backlash against the use of GM crops in the UK, which led to crops being damaged and destroyed, which led to farmers withdrawing from studies on GM crops, and which has led to there being very few GM modified crops in the UK food chain. Now, that's for several reasons, and one of them I think is the commercial way in which GM has been pushed to the public, and I think there's good reasons to doubt whether the motivations behind some of GM research were right. But at the same time, I think the science behind genetically modified crops hasn't been given the best hearing it could have had. There are advantages in terms of reduced use of fertilizer and insecticide and so on from using GM crops, that perhaps if we can evaluate more on a case-by-case basis, we can see the benefit of genetically modifying some of our food. But that dialogue didn't happen, or it happened too late, because there was a backlash, and by the time there was a backlash, it really became difficult for the scientists to engage in that public debate effectively. The same thing, controversially, could also be said maybe about fracking as a technology for extracting gas and minerals from the ground. There is a reaction to that, and I think the reaction is partly because the people that have discovered that technology failed to do a good job of explaining how it could be used and that there were not substantial risks involved. So I want to look at something closer to our own field, cognitive systems, or quite close to cognitive systems. And this is the idea of converging technologies. And I want to show you two views of converging technologies, one which originated in the US. These are both at the start of the 21st century. The first one was a 2001 National Science Foundation sponsored conference, and it's summarized in this report from Rocco and Bainbridge. And the second was a report which was commissioned by the European Union and written by Nordman and his colleagues just a couple of years later. And this report was a response to the outcome of the NSF conference. What are converging technologies? Well, as defined by the NSF conference, the phrase convergent technologies referred to the synergistic combination of four provinces of science and technology: nanoscience, biotechnology and biomedicine, information technology, including computing and communications, and cognitive science, including cognitive neuroscience. So we are part of this convergence as seen by this group of people. And they were very optimistic in their 2001 report about convergent technologies and the possibility for really improving human life. And they called their report Converging Technologies for Improving Human Performance. And they called for more investment in convergent technologies. They called for coordination, action from different sectors, not just in academia, but also in industry. They suggested technological enhancement of humans, both for civilian and for military purposes. And they said there's a new renaissance happening in science based on a holistic understanding of nature brought about by these four approaches coming together. Here's a little epigram from one of the people at that conference. If the cognitive scientists can think it, the nano people can build it, the bio people can implement it, and the IT people can monitor and control it. There you go. And they were confident that they understood risk as well when they wrote this report. They had a quote from James Albus about risk. Because there's risk. We don't know what's going to happen with converging technologies, but they said we understand how to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. We know how to use knowledge about the world to predict the future. We have algorithms that can decide what is desirable, plan how to get it. We have procedures to estimate costs, risks, and benefits of potential actions. We can write computer programs to deal with uncertainty and compensate for unexpected events. So they expected the technologies themselves to protect against uncertainty and against risk. This is a summary of that vision. It's actually from Roger Strand's group in Norway and from a paper that his group wrote. But essentially you have time along the bottom here. You have the convergence of nanoscience, molecular biology, ICT, and cognitive science. You have the new renaissance happening here, and then all kinds of good things happen, including enhanced humanity. And if anything goes wrong, ethically, then we apply the old rule of corrective action. Something bad might happen, but then we'll fix it later because all these other good things are going to happen and we want to have those. So the European response to that is remarkably cautionary, and you should read both reports. And they took the US report as its starting point, and they were very cynical and skeptical about the promises and the expectations in that report. And the report calls for strong society involvement. Do we want this? Is it a good thing? How do we decide it's a good thing? They were very cautious about enhancing human performance as a goal. They weren't sure if that should be a goal of research at all. And this is one of the things that we need to have a societal debate about. Should we enhance human performance? And they preferred specific goals that they could identify as benefiting European society in a much more direct way. And they said, well, look, we can have convergent technologies if it leads to these things which we know are going to be good. So, and this is again from Roger Strand's group, a summary of that report. And you see, again, the 4 areas merging, but merging to result in specific converging technologies for the European Knowledge Society, CTEX they called it. And they said, well, CTEX would be good for treating obesity. Let's think about those. Let's maybe have some funding in that area. Or CTEX for decoupling growth and transport, for dealing with the issues we have around transport in Europe. But perhaps outside the domain of what is European values would be converging technologies for enhanced human performance. Perhaps that's not something that we in Europe want to embrace. So I think this is an example of the European thinking about science, that Europe looks at its core values, and I think this is a good thing, and says, how do we apply these core values to decide what kind of science we want to do and that we're going to fund? And it will increasingly demand that we as researchers engage in this process of discussing this, and if we don't, the discussions will go ahead anyway without us, and I think they'll be much poorer without us. So the second part of my talk leads on from that background. How do we apply ethics in cognitive systems research? And again, I'm going to start off with some quotes. So again from Helga Nowotny. We have to start thinking more about risk and understanding what risks are and doing some work to try and understand risks. Against the background of inherent uncertainty about the future, from which, of course, scientific potential is derived, it is necessary to reach beyond the knowable context of application to the unknowable context of implication. We have to think what is going to happen beyond the immediate application that our project is about, to what might be the consequence 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line. This is what the European Commission is asking us to do. There's a question as to whether it's even possible. There are many futurologists who try to predict the future. Most of them fail miserably. But the European Commission is endorsing futurology by saying, we do have to have a go at this. We might get it wrong, but it's better to have tried and failed. Knowledge producers, that's us as scientists, have to reach out and anticipate reflexively the implications of research processes. They want us to do this forward thinking. And we also have to engage in dialogue. It's not enough to think ourselves about this. We also have to talk to the other sectors of society. Science communicators have been concentrating on finding ways for the public to accept the research agenda without sufficiently fostering a meaningful exchange. This was true of robot companions. When we started Robot Companions, we had a theme on acceptance of robots. And it took some time to convince people that acceptance comes later. You have to talk about what people really think about robots before saying, well, we need to persuade people to accept these. We need to discuss with them whether they think they're a good idea. And then there might be issues about acceptance if you've really decided that they are useful. So we came up with this framework for applying ethics in robot companions, which I think can also be applied in cognitive systems. And it has 2 dimensions, and it's based on an idea from Helga Nowotny, which he himself got from somebody else. You'll have to look at his paper. It's called, I can't remember. You Google his website, and you will find some information on the ethics cross. There are 2 dimensions. One is societal impacts. We have to think about the societal impacts of the research we do, not just in the short and medium term, which we might do when we do user studies, or we might do some kind of empirical ethics. We might take our robot or our cognitive system, try it out with some people, and see how they respond to it. And we might do that in the context of a research or an application-funded study. But also we need to think about the long-term and society-changing impacts. And this is where people in science and technology studies are active, but we shouldn't leave it to them to think about the long-term impacts of our research. Often they're doing it without being fully informed of the nature of our research, and we should work with them to better scope out possible futures. We shouldn't leave it to people like Ray Kurzweil to decide what our technologies are going to be useful for. We should, as a community, be engaging in that debate and be tempering some of the enthusiasm for things which probably can't happen, as well as perhaps tempering some of the concerns about things that people are worried about that probably also can't happen. But the other aspect of this, the other axis, is a research practice. And this is about, on the one hand, doing our science in a more open way, so people can see what we're doing and why we're doing it and understand it. And the European Union right now has a big move towards open science, particularly in terms of publications, but expect to see more in terms of making your work, your labs, accessible and open to the public. And that also means then public engagement as well. We should be doing more as scientists to talk to other sectors of society and explain what it is that we're trying to do. The Commission in 2008 put together a code of conduct for research in nanosciences, which is an interesting and useful model. And it's perhaps good to look at this to see what kind of things that they came up with, because this was, I think, largely inspired by some of the activities in thinking about science that I've been describing. The whole thing's worth looking at. I've just highlighted a couple of things. That nanoscience, nanotechnology research should be conducted in accordance with the precautionary principle. So that's quite a strong statement. We should only do things which we know are safe. It should be inclusive. Governance of research activities should be guided by principles of openness and respect legitimate right of access and so on. It should allow the decision-making processes of all stakeholders, not just scientists. So it's open science, and it's accountable. Researchers and research organizations should remain accountable for the social, environmental, and human health impacts that their research may impose on present and future generations. That's quite a big one, accountability. Do we really feel that we can be held accountable for the research that we're doing? It's a different way of thinking about science from the traditional view that we're just there exploring and discovering the world, describing it, we're neutral, to now is shifted to do your science is impacting on the world. What you do in your science could have a negative impact. If that happens, you're responsible. But this is the way that many people are thinking about science now. Coming from science and technology studies, there have been a lot of projects sponsored by the European Commission that are thinking about this, mapping out the future and scoping it and how it's going to impact on us. So this is a project called TechnoLife, which I think finished in 2011. And the aim of TechnoLife was to do some future scoping in this area, or in several areas, but one of the areas they chose was converging technologies. The debate I've just described to you about the convergence of cognitive science, neuroscience, nanoscience, and so on. And what they have done in this project, and I think it's worth looking at to see one approach at least to how we can begin to have that broader dialogue and to scope out possible futures. And I think we're at the stage now with the European Union that they've decided to go down this path, but they don't yet have a methodology that they're sure of, that they know is going to work. It's a huge experiment to see if we can try and govern science in this new way of trying to anticipate the risks and building risky science, or taking out risky science and just doing non-risky science. I think you could argue that it may not work. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not sure about this agenda, that these uncertainties, some of them are too big to be able to say much about them at this stage. But even so, there are people looking for strategies that are going to help us at least to try and identify the range of risks and to see what other groups in society think the risks are. So Roger Strand, who has been leading TechnoLife, together with researchers in Paris, Manchester, Lancaster, I think mainly people in science and technology studies, so mainly people more towards sociology. And there's a methodology to try and map out the ethical issues by engaging with people and getting them to imagine situations that could happen in the future and what ethical issues those might raise. And the methodology is this, and it's set out in more detail on their website. Identify what the hot topics are, and then engage in a participatory debate with stakeholders. That could be anybody, but members of the public, for instance, about those hot topics. And in order to prime that debate, maybe use some media or some other probes in order to stimulate thinking. Then they have an online voting procedure on issues, and they do some quantitative analysis to identify what are the important arguments and concerns, what are the imaginaries, what are the things that people think could happen or could go wrong, and what are the alternative reference frames that people are bringing to thinking about these technologies and their possible consequences. So I'm going to show you a short film which was developed by TechnoLife on converging technologies and was used in this as part of one of these exercises in order to stimulate people to think about converging technologies and its potential impacts. And you can get this movie from their website. So I think we can agree that that movie is pretty creepy. And it takes ideas which I think were intended to be optimistic, and it shows, certainly by the background music, if you watch it without sound, it's very different. But the music is very creepy. And obviously the message is, this is disturbing, do we really want this? And it's a way of provoking thought. And it's a good way, perhaps, to provoke people to think about the negative implications of convergent technologies. On the other hand, are we provoking to think about the positive implications? Should we be doing that at the same time? I think this is a great project, and it's interesting to see what's coming out of it. So that they, in convergent technologies, they found hot topics with the relationship between normality and perfection. Not surprising given the movie. Freedom of choice and social difference, which is more interesting because it's not really brought up in the movie. Change in the life cycle and lifespan of individuals and the human species. And what was interesting, that most participants strongly in favour of ensuring that enhancements be implemented within pluralistic and diverse societies and value systems. So that, yeah, maybe we want enhancements, but let's not have one idea of what is perfection, of what should be normal. And social justice came up as a key issue. You know, how are we going to ensure that everybody gets access to this? So I think this kind of scoping exercise is interesting and useful. The European Commission is funding it. They will fund more of it. Should we, as a community, be involved in this kind of exercise? Should we be trying to shape it? So I'm going to quickly talk about a field that I've been thinking about, robots in care. And there's a short paper on this that I published at that tiny URL, Robotics in Care. It was prompted by several things, but one of these was the Barometer survey, which I don't know if you've seen this, but there was a very large survey of European countries. 27 countries, nearly 27,000 respondents to this survey on the possible use of robotics. And I think we can be sure that European policy on robotics has been influenced by this survey. I'm not saying that robot companions would have been successful without it, but certainly there were things that came out quite negatively when they asked people about their view of robots. On the other hand, most people were fairly positive about robots. It was just some aspects of robotics that they were worried about. One of the things that we were worried about was the use of robots in care. So in which areas do you think that the use of robots should be banned? So that's quite a strong question. You know, not just we shouldn't do research here, but we should just ban it altogether. And a remarkable 60% of this 27,000 said it banned the use of robots in care of children, elderly, and the disabled. And this is even more interesting when you look down the list and you see that military and security robots, only 7% want to ban robots from killing humans, if they're not from Europe, I guess. And but 60% don't want robots looking after their children or old people. So I'm not happy with the design of this survey, because I think you could have rephrased this. You could have said robots for assisting in the care of children or the elderly. Or you could have said robots for killing enemy soldiers. And you might have got a different response. And a psychologist designing this questionnaire, and I am a psychologist at heart, would have probably designed it differently and tested different versions. But nevertheless, it's still a striking result that 60% could be against. Are we at that GM moment in Europe where we won't be able to develop robots for care because there's just so much opposition to it? Why are people worried about robots in care? Well, one of the possible reasons is that worried about social isolation, that if we bring robots into the aged care sector, then we'll stop looking after old people with human contact altogether, that we'll just leave robots, people in the care of RoboCare, Rosie, Wakamuru, and so on, and we'll just leave them there. We won't worry about them or think about them again. So I think that's possibly at the base of what people worry about. And this worry has been picked up by ethicists like the Sparrows, who wrote this paper, In the Hands of Machines, The Future of Aged Care, when they specifically picked on this issue. I just want to talk in the last few minutes about what we might do to sort of help or contribute to this debate. Now, I'm conscious that I'm entering the debate as somebody with a position, but then I know from Helga Nowotny that we all have positions, that nobody is neutral. My position is that I think that robots could be useful in care. And we're asked to imagine possible futures. And I think our contribution could be helping in imagine futures. But also, we can all imagine possible futures where extremely dystopian, or even some that are extremely utopian. But only a small subset of those are actually likely futures, things that could ever happen. And that's where I think our contribution could be, because right now we have the possibility to imagine all sorts of things that could happen, but that probably never will happen. And some of those are the things that people are most worried about. One of the things that people are worried about robots in care is the possibility of a slippery slope, that we might have robots that may be able to help with the care of older people, but will fall down a slippery slope where we increasingly leave our older people in the care of those robots and don't engage with them at all. And a slippery slope is a logical argument, and slippery slope arguments can be correct. The general form that a slippery slope takes is that an action that seems harmless establishes a trajectory that with high probability leads to an unintended but unethical final outcome. That's the slippery slope. So in robots in care, the idea is that introducing care robots is going to have a knock-on effect of reducing their contact with other people, and that's going to snowball, ultimately leading to older people being left in the hands of machines, as Sparrow and Sparrow suggested in their paper. Now, slippery slopes can be valid, but only if we can show that there's a causal chain whereby you can go from the intended positive outcome to the unwanted outcome in a small number of steps, which are all quite likely. And the problem is that this causal chain is not always justified adequately, or that some of the links along the chain that look plausible turn out to be low probability, and therefore when you think about the cumulative likelihood of the slippery slope, it can be quite low. So for example, cumulative likelihoods are things that we're not very good at calculating. If you think about trees falling down in a forest, it's a blustery day, one tree might fall down. If the probability of a tree falling down and knocking down another one is high, say 90%, you might think, well, there's a good probability the whole wood's going to be flattened. But the reality is that one tree blowing down, knocking down another, although that might be high probability, the knock-on effect when you multiply out all the probabilities is that only a relatively small number of trees in that wood might be flattened. We're not very good at intuiting these cumulative likelihoods when there are a large number of steps, and each step itself might be likely, but the cumulative likelihood could be low. So what is the warrant? What is the explanation for why we think that introducing robots in care could lead to a slippery slope where people are left in the care of robots with no human contact? Well, the reason is economic, or at least Sparrow and Sparrow say that it's economic pressure which will lead to the slippery slope. It costs a lot to care for people, and if you can reduce this cost by bringing in robots, all well and good. If robots are really cheaper than people, why not leave people out of it altogether? So it seems that there is a warrant that you could find a justification of how economic pressures could lead to reduced human contact. But we can think about this a bit more. What does it really take for people to be left alone to be looked after by robots? First of all, the robots will have to be fully autonomous, so they won't need to be supervised by human care staff. That sounds like a big ask. Second, the use of robots should not lead to more effective deployment of human care, because maybe it could actually work the other way, that by having robots to use in care, we could use humans in care of the elderly in a more effective manner. We also have to assume that older people themselves don't take any action to compensate for the loss of social contact. And we have to assume that governments, companies, charities and so on also don't care about this sufficiently to try and mitigate the consequences of introducing robots in care. So I'll quickly go through each of these. It seems unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future, that robots will be that autonomous, and we can discuss that later. But I think it's much more likely that care will be provided by robot-human teams. If we think about robot-human teams looking after older people, if we think about robots assisting in the care of the elderly, and we ask that question in a Barometer survey, I think we'll get a different answer. The use of robots could actually make human care more effective, because caring roles could become more professional. Carers could be better paid. We read about, in the UK certainly, how care workers are underpaid. They therefore, sometimes that leads to them abusing the people in their care, and it certainly leads to them having low fulfillment and poor job quality. The robots could give more time for human-human interaction. The robot cleans the house or prepares the food, while the human carer interacts with the person. There was a story in the paper last week about carers having just 15 minutes to look after each person that they visited. And sometimes people had to decide whether they use that 15 minutes to have something to drink or to be helped to go to the toilet. So it's not as if there's a lot of human care in these situations right now. But certainly we would want to not lose that human care. Perhaps we could improve the human care through having a robot assistant. Older people will also adapt, I think. We can say that there are an increasing number of older people. We will stay active longer. We will be better connected through ICT technologies. It seems unreasonable to think that we won't actually do something to help ourselves. After all, it's our generation we're talking about here. Do we want these robots or don't we want these robots? I think personally I do want the robots, but I want to ensure I have human contact too, and I'll be active as an older person to see that happens. Older people can use social networks. Computer literate, often umbilically tied to the internet. The aging baby boomers, that some of us, may find the transition to a world of virtual caring relationships and social life at a distance exceptionally congenial. There may be compensations in social networking. And as a generation, we are likely to have significant political power, so it's unlikely that our voice will go unheeded. So these are just some reasons why we might not progress down that slippery slope to leaving older people entirely in care. And it's about getting the right balance. If, as the Eurobarometer survey suggests, people are turning against the possibility of robot carers already before they even exist in any practical sense, then this is worrying, because the costs of not developing those technologies in terms of our future welfare could outweigh the risks. And we have to balance these two risks, the risks of not doing it against the risks of doing it and it going wrong. So we have to look at both sides of the story. What is the cost of not getting this benefit of robot carers against what is the risk if we might end up here? What is the likelihood of each of those things? There's a role for research here, I think. Our role is to help analyze some of these dystopian futures, explain why they might not happen, why robots may not be able to be sufficiently autonomous so that they'll be able to care for older people, why the utopian vision equally may not happen, but why this might happen and the things that we could do to promote this happening and the things that we could do to prevent this from happening. I think as researchers we can be active doing these things. So, yeah, I'm going to skip this. It's just more about why care robots could be useful. Go on to this. It's not just older people that the Eurobarometer survey was about. It's about younger people. It was also about the disabled. The UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People actually makes it an obligation for countries to do research and development in new technologies to assist those with disability. So I think that is an incentive to try and build useful robots, useful cognitive systems technologies to help people. Many of you may have seen Joanna ORourke. She gave a speech to the United Nations. She's a 16-year-old Irish girl with profound disability, and this is what she said about robotics.
A challenge to the international high-tech sector to build her a robot to help improve her life. Joanne was born without limbs and was speaking about the use of technology to an international gathering at the UN in New York.
Going over the speech in her New York hotel room early this morning, Joanna ORourke was chosen by the UN's Telecommunication Union to talk to an international gathering about her life's journey using high technology. And it's fair to say she wowed the audience with her easy manner and articulate arguments. And she had a serious challenge for everyone there.
It is my wish, and it's my challenge to you and to others out there, to build me a robot. Yes, that's right, a robot. It sounds almost insane, but as a child and even today, I've always wanted and would love to have a robot. The The main thing the robot will be doing is picking up the objects I drop, such as a pen, knife, fork, and/or my phone. This robot will become my hands and legs.
So I think it's true to say that if you talk to the stakeholders, there are some who will want robot assisters, assistive robot technologies. And I think we should be doing this. We should be finding those communities and asking them to help us in making the case for the research that we want to do. And we need to, of course, watch out that there could be a cognitive systems or robot divide, as there is now a digital divide, with these things only being available to a small sector of society. So, and there's more on this idea of assistive robots in this roadmap paper, which we publish as part of Robot Companions. So, I want to sum up. Is it no-win or win-win? Ethics is about understanding risk in science, dealing with its implications. That's the view, I think, that the European Union now takes. It wants us to look at risk and try and understand and evaluate the risks. It wants us to engage with multiple sectors in society in doing that. It's an important task, and we shouldn't just leave it to experts in ethics or science and technology, because they don't necessarily have the information about these technologies which will help them to imagine the future as it could possibly be. They can imagine lots of futures, and science fiction helps enormously in our field to imagine futures that are bad or good. But actually plausible possible futures, you need to know something about the technology itself in order to imagine them properly. We as scientists will be held accountable for the results of our research. That's clear from the nanosciences document, that they recognize the importance of that. As cognitive systems researchers, we should engage and we should lead this debate. And I think it's potentially win-win because it could lead to better research. It could lead to more focused, more directed research. It could lead us to cut down lines of inquiry which aren't going to lead to beneficial outcomes, and it could be to the benefit of everybody. I just want to finish with this. It's a copy of a letter sent by scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, and it's what they wrote to the government after the invention of the nuclear weapon. And I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but I do think the impact of cognitive systems research is potentially as momentous in the long term as the discovery or the invention of nuclear weapons. They said, we the members of the association feel a very special responsibility to the people of America because of the role we have had in developing the atomic bomb and because of our special awareness of the possibilities of atomic energy for the advance of our civilization or its utter destruction. And I think that kind of statement you could possibly take out the idea of atomic energy and put in cognitive systems, the possibility that can lead for great advances for our civilization, or even, if some people are to be believed, its utter destruction. But we do have a responsibility to think about those potential long-term consequences. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Questions? And please use the mic so we can have all that.
Hi, thank you for a very stimulating talk, but I begin to wonder that maybe we need to roll back that slippery slope and examine, have we examined enough diversity of culture and how we approach, for example, care in society or rehab, whatever domain you want to take, and really examine a human-driven approach rather than a technology-driven approach.
Yeah, I agree that technology isn't the answer to the problem of the aging society. But I think it's, at the same time, it can be part of the solution. The solution is going to be much more broad-ranging. And there are many things which we could do which are possibly going to be easier and cheaper than developing assistive robots. I'm just concerned that we should have the right debate and that we shouldn't necessarily be distracted by things which are unlikely to happen. And I think one of the things that's unlikely to happen is what people have called the sort of the robot factory, older people being left entirely in the care of robots. Now that's a nightmare scenario which is being used to put people off what is a more plausible scenario for me of bringing more robots into the home and those robots doing a more useful job for people. It's also an economic issue, and older care is an economic issue. I put up there the costs of what it costs right now to look after people. And to look after people in their homes is much cheaper than to look after them in institutions. So if assistive robots could help people stay in their homes longer, then that could be a huge saving for the economy. Now you have to balance all these things together. I think we have to look at changing our social arrangements as we have more older people in society. We have to think about whether it's necessary for so many people to be in one-person houses. But we also have to look at how technology can help us.
I loved your talk, and I absolutely love your new work on the slippery slope. But I'm not going to ask you about your own work. I'm going to ask you about that great review you had at the beginning of these different perspectives. I'm particularly concerned about the idea that because science isn't perceived as neutral, and it's perceived as a part of the industrial whatever complex, that there's parts of it that we shouldn't explore because we all know that risk is never zero. So if we aren't exploring and understanding things, there seems to me that there's some part of science that needs to go forward. And also, don't forget that there's academic research, which the EU funds, but there's industrial research and other countries' research. So it's not like science stops, even if the EU decides to redefine science and stop parts of it locally. So it seems like that's a very dangerous perspective, making science, taking away the neutral aspects of science. Even though I agree that we're the best informed to talk about the ethical consequences, I'm worried about this idea of shutting down parts we don't want to know about.
I don't think everything is going to be shut down, and of course ERC will still fund individual scientists, but I guess even there the sort of the broader agendas will be important that you are consistent with them. So I'm worried like you. I think there should be some exploratory science, but I'm also sympathetic to this view that there isn't really a view from nowhere. There's no true objectivity and independence. We all care about what we do.
So you referred, when you refer to the authority, you refer to European Union, European Commission, with regards to the ethical issues towards robotics, cognitive science. I would be interested how different are the attitudes of the authorities in the North America, China, Japan?
I think a lot of those countries have not gone down this route of I mean, I think in America it's much more you can do the things you want to do, and a lot of the robotics, for instance, is funded by the military. The European Commission specifically says it doesn't fund anything to do with the military. I don't know about China, but I do know that Europe has a particularly strong emphasis on ethics in research and has had historically, possibly dating back to events that happened in history. But and I think it's part of our European tradition and a good thing that we do this. So I think in general it's something to be glad about and to be encouraged that the European Union is taking an ethical stance on the kind of research it funds.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, and I particularly liked your balanced treatment of elder care robots. But it seems to me you left a dimension out. You were strangely silent about distribution and commercialization issues. And commercialization isn't ethically neutral, and it affects this debate in all sorts of ways. I was on a group where we talked about Monsanto syndrome on the GM debate, which was the scientists said it was safe, the public said, we don't trust big corporations, and the scientists said, but it's safe, and the public said, but we don't trust big corporations. And applying that lack of dialogue to your elder care, I think there's another dimension. I mean, I see it as a cybernetic loop rather than a slippery slope, but it's profitable, commercially profitable to build robots for elder care. it's not particularly profitable for people to remain in their communities. So what we're looking at is an economic pressure for bright young people to leave their village in Greece, to come to work in Sheffield with you, to build elder care robots, leaving old people unattended in Greece. I don't know how much difference it makes. I just want to say it's a dimension you seem strangely silent about.
Well, I did talk about the digital divide, but I mean, I think you're right. I think with GM crops, there's a kind of guilt by association. The scientists, because Monsanto was the big figure in actually selling and distributing GM crops, it looked as though the scientists were complicit. Not all of them are, obviously. There's a risk in cognitive systems that so much of our research, particularly in America, is funded by the military. And it looks as though, or it can look to outsiders, that we're developing military robots and we're looking for applications that can fund our military robot program. I would dispute that making assistive robots actually makes money, because no companies actually want to make assistive robots. There are lots of other kinds of robots that they'll make, but finding a big company that will want to invest in this is very, very hard. I think you're right, that the commercialization brings all sorts of other issues.
Yeah, so I mean, it's worth thinking about whether we might be quite precautionary about the precautionary principle as well. One reason is how much, if we are skeptical about futurism, and if we are living in rather times when people are quite skeptical and sometimes reactionary about new technologies and blue sky science, there is a chance you can cut things off. I mean, it does make you think if you know, the precautionary principle had been applied perhaps to Galileo when he turned his telescope on Jupiter, or when Alexander Fleming was playing about with bits of mucus in a Petri dish, what might have been the outcome then? And thinking about Galileo again, of course, there was a European board who was looking over his shoulder at his research at the time. This is not to say that, of course, scientists shouldn't, you know, look for the widest possible discussion of their ideas and some of the possible outcomes, but there does seem to be some dangers of you know, avenues that could be cut off if we are precautionary about the things we don't know, because of course research in many ways is trying to find out what we don't know.
I think you're right, but I don't know what the answer is. The European Union answer appears to be, we don't know if futurism works, but we want to do an experiment to see if it can help. And I think we're engaged in that experiment. But I think there are some things which are easier to predict than others. So at the start of the computer revolution, we wouldn't have been able to predict, for instance, bullying, school bullying via social networks. Obviously that's a bad outcome, but no matter how many think tanks had looked at it, we wouldn't have come up with that when the digital computer was invented. And this is going to be true for so many of the consequences of what we're doing now. But maybe there are some things which we could identify and isolate and decide that's not a good place to go.
I just wanted to go back to that that slide from the EU report, which had the little bit of corrective action, which you know, we were going to try and take if it turns out. Yeah, sorry, it's way back. Where, you know, if we go into some region which is outside the EU's core values, you know, was that? No, I think it was the EU. It was the EU one. That one. That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, the one that you just went past. That's it. Yeah. Okay. This little corrective action here.
So this isn't the EU view. This is Roger Strand's interpretation of the Rocco and Bainbridge view about what we should do.
Well, whoever's view it is, I just think it's a little bit optimistic.
Yes, well, that's
I think
what they
that
think
the trouble, whilst I applaud the sentiments behind it, I think that the trouble is that there are sort of Darwinian market forces which are going to make it very difficult to enforce that kind of thing. Because even if the EU did take this kind of precautionary
well, this is the EU view here. The EU view is much more likely to say that a lot of things are outside the domain of things they're going to fund, because they're going to apply a precautionary principle.
Right.
They're going to say, yes, we want to do it for obesity, transport, but you know, that's
okay,
about it.
Either way, if you decide not to fund them as well, the trouble
Yeah.
is that what concerns me is that things that are outside of somebody's set of core values, that there's going to be somebody else for whom they're inside their set of core values, and they're going to get funded anyway, and then the floodgates are opened, and I'm not quite sure what we can do to stop slippery slopes in various of these domains, which when you've got these kinds of competitive, market forces that are going to enable cognitive enhancement to, as an example, to become prevalent.
I think that's true, but I think public funding is going to accelerate, or hopefully accelerate, research in areas, and cutting off public funding should slow down research in areas that, say, the EU doesn't want to encourage. But I think you're right, you can't control what people will do. People outside public funding will do work in these areas.
So I wanted to pick up on the sort of the strand of discussion concerning outside of EU influences, the research being done in the US or in China, etc. To what extent do you think the EU or EU scientists can and should try to influence the discussion in those areas outside of the EU?
I think the EU has the chance to do that. I think certainly in the US, people look at EU funding arrangements, and I know lots of US colleagues who are quite jealous of the way we are funded inside the EU and the way that we're not tethered to the NHS or to DARPA for our funding. So the EU is in some ways quite generous and open with its funding. I don't think the EU model is broken, and I don't think that these developments in the EU model are necessarily a bad thing. I think it's something that we need to discuss as a community, because if we don't respond to them adequately, it will affect us. But yes, I would like to see world research in cognitive systems look more at the ethical issues.
I have a question, but I'm afraid to stand up because I might harm you. I wanted to, actually, it was very interesting, and I had several questions, some of which, oops, sorry, I've already tweeted, so yeah, I'm somehow okay with the conference aim. Can we go back to the TechnoLife video, and if you could address, yeah.
You want me to play it?
No, no, thank you.
Play it without sound.
Ideally, the question is, as a psychologist, what would you think if the aim of robotics were to somehow aim at perfection by altering completely what we are, and so, for instance, getting rid of emotions on the one hand and replacing those things with decision-making systems? Is that dystopia, or is it me thinking it's too much?
I think it's an active area of debate. If you look at transhumanism, which is an active movement, or posthumanism sometimes called, a lot of people who actually are very much in favor of self-improvement and self-intervention. So, for example, if you could have an implant that could abolish negative moods, would you say that that's a bad thing? You might say it's okay for treating depression, but if you're not somebody who's clinically depressed, why shouldn't you have an implant that abolishes bad moods? So I think it's a very grey area between what is human enhancement and what isn't. And there's also, I think, a potential debate about whether it is wrong to enhance ourselves, because in many ways what we've been doing historically is enhancing ourselves in various ways, and why should we stop now? And the transhumanists, the posthumanists will make that case that there isn't one static version of humanity, that we are a species that evolves, and we're evolving by integrating more and more technology into our lives, and why do we want to stop now? So it's it's not a. I think ethics is an area where there are just lots of questions and very few answers. And what happens when I started the Robot Companions societal workshops, I thought ethicists are going to come in here and give us some answers, but they don't. They just come in and ask lots of questions.
So thank you very much for the very wide and insightful and interesting talk. And there's a lot of points that are actually coming out of it that I'm sure are going to resonate in the minds of the audience for the rest of the meeting and much beyond that. Taking a wider view, just beyond the European Union, given the fact that our planet is getting much more globalized and there's free exchange of memes, of people, of products, of ideas, how much of a really thoughtful policy is the one that the European Union is trying to impose at the moment? Given the fact that there's going to be other places with different guidelines regarding what kind of research will take place, with very different, if you want, situations regarding governmental intervention and the possibility for the people to have a voice on what's happening, and very different situations also regarding openness of results for research. So how can the European Union play an active role within such a world system which is as diverse as the one that we have right now? And it's not only the United States. If you have a look at the research output in the last years, there's a very big change towards the East. So how do ethics play in this interesting question for the next 20 years? And what the EU can do in that respect?
I think those are all fair questions. So I think the EU thinks it has limited resources. It should fund the things that it thinks are going to lead to positive societal impacts in Europe. And it's fairly specific and direct in that. Similarly, the EPSRC in the UK is having that agenda more directed, obviously, towards the UK economy. I think these other national funding agencies and different companies will be following their own agendas. I don't think it's necessarily going to hamper our competitiveness to have an ethical aspect to the way we do research. But I guess it does add an extra overhead in terms of
how pragmatic is it to say that we're cutting down a stream of research when it's going to take place in other countries and the outcome will anyway come back to the European Union?
I guess they just take the broad view that if there's less money going into that, there's more money going into something else that they care more about. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's just a quick comment. You've talked about the risks about not doing things, like the risks about not having care, and other people have talked about that. It seems to me there's an issue of rates of change, and so everything's changing so fast, and having a generation without GM crops may have lost, may have caused some kind of lost opportunity, but because things are moving so fast, it doesn't seem to me to be a terrible thing to delay by 10 years the rollout of these companions or whatever. So this kind of balance, you're not saying no to things forever when for a generation or a cycle of research funding, you say no to them.
Yeah, I think I would agree that the European Union not funding things doesn't mean they won't get done. And that you can take that both ways. It's either bad because bad things will happen anyway, or it's good because the European Union is not cutting down all opportunities for doing the research if you think it is worthwhile.
How ethical are the BCI?
The BCI, brain-computer interface?
Or brain-body-computer interfaces?
I wouldn't like to say, but I think they come under this umbrella of converging technologies, potentially. I don't think it's ethical or not ethical. I think that if you take the perspective of the European Union on this, they would ask, what are you using BCI for? Are you using it to help somebody who's profoundly disabled? Or are you using it to improve yourself? And if it's the latter, they would want to ask more questions about exactly what you want to use BCI for. But I think, that the European Union is not against sort of, for instance, us using hands-free technologies to make phone calls, things like that. I don't think it is yet to decide its strategy on these things. But what it's doing is it's making more clear that it has priorities which it thinks are safe, while it's evaluating these other things. And there's this whole stream of funding in science and technology, which is funding projects in many of these areas. Technolife looked at 4 areas, and convergent technologies was just one of them. So, and there will be views on this. And then that information goes back to the EU, and we've yet to see what they do with it.
Okay. Thanks a lot to the speaker for a stimulating talk.